if we run out of time. So I think we should play it by ear, but
Yeah, exactly.
I feel that, you know, you shouldn't be rushed in presenting what it is that you have to present.
Okay. Because I thank you. I appreciate that, Victoria, because I do have a whole bunch of new slides I added. And, you know, this is the first time I'm actually going to be presenting some of the data. And so it's good to know. I just want to try to get as much of
Yes,
it out there.
I think we should really go with that. And then, you know, we can always, I can adapt to what the time is. And also, you know, I'm sure I'll have other opportunities to share some things with our colleagues in Siena as well. So that can go for another time, not to worry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so if you agree, we are ready to start. And yeah, I just wanna thank you and tell you that Loretta is going to connect. She has also another meeting in the same time, so she is ending her presentation into this meeting with the University of Florence, and she's coming just to welcome and to introduce you. By the way, we will start because we needed to be in time. We have so many topics to discuss, and we are very happy to have you here, even if not in presence, but virtually connected in order to discuss with you these two important topics of transformative learning, radicalization, de-radicalization, and for sure, displacement and replacement model. I needed to thank also the colleagues from University of Siena, but also from other universities that are here connected. I just want to give a special welcome to Francesco Magni from University of Bergamo that I see in the grid of the people presenting, of the attendees. And I know, Victoria, that maybe you met Francesco in person when
Yes.
you were in Bergamo. Yeah, when you were in Bergamo 2 years ago, and probably also the years before. And I need also to welcome the people connected from the YouTube streaming channel that are following us from the other channel. So we have here connected almost about 100 people. I know that other people will join us, so the number will increase in the next few times. And I need to give Claudio Melacarne the floor just in order to give the perspective from the forward project of this webinar. And then I will introduce you, and we will start giving you finally the floor. Claudio, you can go ahead.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much to Amrai, Victoria, and I'm very glad to be with you in this meeting. The time is past, and we need to meet all together again somewhere in the world. And this is an honor for us to be this occasion to discuss with you about a topic, and this topic is very interesting. I think it's very hot because we started 3 years ago to share some hypotheses, some ideas to go into this area of research without any critical perspective. I mean, without only a security approach. The landscape is to interpret the radicalization into the field of education. This is our idea, and I'm very glad to introduce the Forward project. And I'm trying to share with you a number of slides. I'm trying to do this, but
it works, which is a miracle today, but it works.
Stai vedendo le slide?
Confermo.
Okay. This meeting is a part of a second year of project, the Forward project, and I'm a member of the research group of this project, and I'm glad to introduce some activities we already done and the next future, the next plan. Loretta Fabbri is the lead of this research group. She's the coordinator, and we are multidisciplinary group. Into this group, there are colleagues from sociology, psychology, education, some from economy, and it's very hard to work together. You know, it's not simple to integrate different perspectives, but it's our, I think, our point of power. And we have fortunately meet Victoria and other colleagues and Amra, and this project is now go on in an international perspective, and it was born in 2 years ago. 2 years ago, and the Ministry of Education in Italy, and in collaboration with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, funded 3 very big projects focused on radicalization, and the ministry give us a very hard mission in Italy. They asked to us to research and to understand some ways to prevent radicalization, starting from a particular point of view. I mean, the ministry, they was thinking about radicalization as religious phenomena. They starting from this point, and we started again from this point. But this project is going on, and so the first general goals of this project is to understand and to research in the field of preventive practices. And as I said, we started from the religious interpretation of the radicalization. And 2 years ago, there was the approach in Italy. So the first problem we had was to understand our point of view. We know that when we talk about radicalization, we enter in a complex settings of words, sentences, pre-critical approach. So sometimes we use radicalization as extreme.
I guess that we have some problems with the Wi-Fi connection. Both of us are here in presence in the department, so I think it was a problem with the Wi-Fi connection of the department.
Beginning to link radicalization processes with the theory of transformation of Metzgerov and other for example, Freire for us or other researchers. And we tried to validate this hypothesis within a global institutional network. We are in touch with some other research group in Turin, Italy, with the United Nations, or some center in Canada, in Columbia University, Georgia, and some other our friends in this topic. The first publication we have done has been published last year in our journal. This international journal is Educational Reflective Practices Journal, and we starting to talk about micro-radicalization as an idea to understand what happens in everyday life in terms of micro action or micro violent action oriented to promote discrimination or act of exclusion. So we are not talking about terrorism acts in this moment, in this project. And finally, the project is at the second year, and we have always worked in three levels: research, studied the practices we already found in the literature in the different countries. Professional development, it means that we had plan and organize master degree and courses for professionals. And adult and continuing education, we had introduced in our program some particular courses in, for example, radicalization and education to help the future social educator to work with more awareness about these issues. And now we are at the second year. We are focusing in particular the action to meetings, seminars. So what we called first prevention action, and this meeting is one of these. This meeting is one of the higher and excellent meeting we are planning to discuss a large with a large audience into the field of education and radicalization. So this is for us one of the best moments to have an international debate and to allow to our audience, students, PhD students, colleagues, to take part in a very open discussion about this topic. I'm very happy because we have done very a lot of activities in our courses, and I'm very happy to see Amra and Victoria, and I hope to see also in present in the next very near future at the Columbia University or here in Arezzo. You can choose where, but we are ready to travel. And so thank you very much. And Alessandra, you have the lead of this. Fortunately, you have the lead of this meeting, and thank you very much for have organized this seminar. And yeah, I will follow you, and I have my questions to these beautiful friends and colleagues.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Claudio, for this first presentation about the topic of the Forward project. And it's a great honor for me and for us to have two eminent speakers as Professor Marsik and Professor Sabike Reyes here presenting with us. I just few words to introduce our guest speakers. Professor Victoria Marsik, who I assume is not necessary to introduce at all because she's, I think, one of the most famous researchers in transformative learning, informal and incidental learning all over the world. And she's professor of education, co-director of Huber Institute and program director of adult learning of Teachers College, Columbia University. And Professor Marsik was the supervisor of my PhD dissertation, also of the PhD dissertation of our colleague Francesca Mraci, and I myself, Loretta, Francesca and Claudio spent several times as a visiting researcher at the Teachers College, Columbia University, as the wonderful and inspiring guidance of Victoria. And to Victoria, we need to have a very strong feeling of gratitude for her guidance, for her constant and inspiring guidance. And Victoria and Karen Watkins were here 2 years ago on May 21st and 22nd, 2019, for a workshop on action learning and action learning conversations applied to the training of professionals that work in the field of a multicultural context. And Amra Sabike Reyes, that we met during the winter school with the University of Georgia and Teachers College last November, thanks to the invitation that Victoria made to Amra, is professor of practice at Columbia University, at the Teachers College, Columbia University. She works on understanding how and why societies fall apart and what role education can play in rebuilding decimated countries. She grew up in Biak, did I pronounce well? Bosnia and Herzegovina. And her masterpiece, The Cat I Never Named, A True Story of Love, War and Survival, was published last year and has a strong, a variety of very positive recensions and feedback from all over the world. So we know that Amra is very busy in this time in order to present in different countries her book and her story, and for sure her study on radicalization and deradicalization. Both Victoria and Amra are going to present today an explanation about the connection between transformative learning theory and radicalization and deradicalization models. And for sure, they will give us a very deep explanation of the first findings of the study that Amra is carrying out about the displacement and replacement educational model for radicalization and deradicalization. Again, thank you for having accepted our invitation. We have no words to express you our gratitude, and now we need to shut up and just give you the floor.
Thank you, Alessandra. Welcome. I'm very pleased to be here, as is my colleague Amra Sabike Reyes, to share with you some of the things that we've been thinking about in collaboration with our partners at the University of Siena. I was so very excited to see you take on this project, and because it really is at the heart of transformation. It has to start with individuals, and it also has to concern the society. The two are two sides of one coin. And so what I would like to do is to set the stage for the work that Amra is doing, to just lay some foundation around a few ideas around how we are thinking about transformative learning, or one way that we're thinking about it. And then share the stage with Amra, who's going to give you much more detail about the work that she has been doing. So Alessandra, can you share my slides? Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And if you want, I think that you might be able to share your screen, right?
I'll try, and if I can't, then you'll show me.
Yeah, I have it.
Okay, I'll see whether I can do that, and you'll tell me if I'm able to. Okay. Okay, are you seeing? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So let me just go to the actual slide view of the whole thing. I don't think our computers were originally made for this kind of thing.
No,
Okay.
but now we can see perfectly your presentation.
Great.
Perfectly.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm going to start with this question of what motivates transformative learning, because as Claudio laid things out, and talked about how the group is thinking about this, we know that we have we learn unconsciously and incidentally and informally all the time, and often our responses to situations are really just automatic. We know that from the work that's been done with brain research, that when we confront situations, our brain makes sense of it and it presents to us an automatic reaction to how we should respond. And that's usually based on our prior socialization, our prior experience to date. And so the question is, why change that? And how to change it? And so to me, that translates into the question of what motivates transformative learning, because change is very hard, and it's hard for anybody. It's fine for somebody else, but not for me. And so I want to start with briefly what some of the motivators are to do this work. Secondly, to just speak a little bit about how we're thinking about transformative learning and how it can be facilitated. Third, to really pose this question, which is where I'm going to hand off to my colleague, Amra, about where individual transformation meets societal norms, expectations, and assumptions, because we are so governed by how we have been socialized in the past that we need to figure out how to disrupt that. And I think in her research, you'll see how other people are disrupting that and how she is proposing that we get out of that loop. If there's time, I would also speak a little bit about how, after Amra speaks, about how to leverage system dynamics in which we are located. So in other words, the social transformation side of what this might look like. So to start, what motivates us to transform? As educators, we try to help people learn things, but people can only learn what they're motivated to learn. And we know that that motivation comes from their own interests and beliefs, etc. So what is it that helps us to create what Claudio mentioned, a disorienting dilemma, something that says to us, it's not productive to continue to think this way. It's not productive to continue to be this way. What are some of those jolts that can cause us to do that hard work? And I think we are experiencing many of those motivators today. And one of them for many of us is our own personal identity. And we as we grow and as we change, we confront who we are, and we decide that maybe we don't like to be that way. And so there's a personal dimension to motivation. It has to do with growing ourselves, becoming more than we are right now, being of more value in the world and to ourselves and to our families and our communities. But that is also really pushed along by these deep social and environmental changes, which seem to be happening quicker and quicker and quicker these days. So demographics, of course, when there's a change in generations, there's always a disruption of how work gets done, how people relate to one another. There's new ways of doing things that will motivate us to transform how we think about things. Many of us who are educators were not motivated to teach online until the pandemic came. And then the shift of the pandemic caused us to be motivated because of the social and environmental changes. Attitudes towards gender, race, and class, climate change is a big motivator these days, because we know that we're not going to have a planet anymore if we don't stop doing things the way we're doing it. Some of you may be motivated by getting a good job in the new economy, and that calls for acting and being very different than in the old economy. So that's a motivator for transformation. And then I think radicalization in particular has come upon our screen based on this migration and immigration shift in the world, the violence that is going on, and the migrations, which lead us to have very different societies with people from all over the world. So we need to think about, when we're working in the area of transformative learning, what is really important and central on the individual's agenda that will lead them or support, and that we can support in embarking on this journey of transformation. I also want to share, a kind of a definition or an idea about how the work of Jack Mesereau, who I have been following and whose footsteps I have been following in, approaches this idea of what transformative learning is. There are many types of transformation, and not all of them involve conscious learning. So there's transformations in leadership. When an organization changes because of the introduction of artificial intelligence and jobs are completely changed, it's not that this is a voluntary kind of thing, and we may or may not feel that we're doing a lot of learning voluntarily, but there is a change in the organization, whether we learn to stay abreast with it or not. And so events change and they transform. But when and how can we learn along with it? And that's the focus that we're taking here. Radicalization is something that, if we understand it and we understand de-radicalization, we can accelerate our own learning and the learning of our communities to be able to really cope and to change better. And so there is a cognitive dimension to transformative learning. And that's kind of where we're focusing, because if we follow what our automatic response to a situation is, that's based on our socialization from the past, it's not that we're learning something new, we are relying on what we did in the past. And so to interrupt that pattern of reliance on something we did automatically, we have to stop and think. We need this cognitive moment of reflection. And that's kind of where we're focusing in this area of transformative learning, but it is not separated from the many other ways to think about this. And Claudio, you mentioned a few of them when you introduced us. There are many different ways to work with transformative learning. So many people work with this from the point of view of adult development, and they think about how we change naturally and organically over our life. When you get married, you change a lot, because you're now not just you're with a partner, and then eventually with a family. And so the natural developments of having a family or taking a new job introduce you to things that you don't consciously think about in terms of your learning, but you're learning all the time. And so developmental shifts in how our minds work and how we think more complexly is another way that one can really look at this. And I must also say that Jack Mesereau, who did take a sort of cognitive, rational approach to this, he also did that in the interests of development. So those two things are somewhat related. But there are people who work much more in the area of the arts, in the affective domains. The idea being that in positive psychology, we know that people are far more motivated by something that brings them joy than something that they have to do. And so the imagination and affective looks and engages people in visioning new realities, in seeing something in a different way that that joyously places us in moments of transformation. And then we need to work to be able to put those in place, which often involves the cognitive, rational, and developmental aspects. And finally, Claudio mentioned Paulo Freire and emancipatory learning, and those various views that work on really the social embodiment of these views and norms, so that we don't think about it because we're part of a collective and this is how we do things. And the only way that we can change that view is to get us to stop and think using cognitive and rational and affective modes of why we do it that way and why it has to be that way and whether things can be different. And so these look like very different approaches, but it's like they're different entrances to the same building. The building is still transformative learning, and these pieces work together. But I'm going to single out and just lay a foundation around Jack Mesereau's work, because that's been influential to all of us who are working in this, who are on this webinar in any case. And he's often called the father of transformative learning, although there are many people who were working at the same time in different ways around what transformative learning looked like, from, as Claudio mentioned again, from different disciplinary or different areas of practice. But he set out initially not to create transformative learning, but he set out to understand how adults learn, because we know that we know a lot about how to help children learn, but in helping children learn, we know what we're teaching them. So we have a view of what it is that they should gain in order to be able to be a skilled and functioning adult. This is also often the case in much informational learning. In other words, if we're teaching people a skill of using some kind of a new machine or working with artificial intelligence or even using a new program on your computer, this requires certain steps that need to be followed, and we understand what that looks like. But there are many areas of life where the way we did things in the past no longer serves us because conditions have so drastically changed. And the intermingling of societies and people and cultures at the level that has come about due to things like migration, immigration, violence, fires, climate change, and all of these things has pushed us to a place where this no longer serves. And so what kind of learning do we do as adults when in fact the way we've thought about things no longer serves us? And so Jack really looked for this, what is distinctly adult about learning, and how can we in fact learn to transform the meanings that we have acquired over a long period of time. And so he defined this process as the process by which we transform our taken for granted frames of references, because the way we think about people from other groups, the way we think about and hold religion, the way we think about our political affiliations, the way we think about what it means to be human, all of these things are things that we acquired over a long period of time, and they whether we're conscious about it or not, we have a point of view about what is right in the situation. Our colleagues might have different points of view. Our neighbors might have different points of view. And exploring and evaluating those different points of view, of those different perspectives, help us to begin to ask questions about our own perspectives. So by examining and revising what we have taken for granted, it disrupts this pattern of automatic meaning making. So I'm in a new situation. I'm seeing that I have a neighbor who's come from a country I maybe don't even know the name of that country, and I don't know how to pronounce it. And but instead of being resistant to what it is they represent and the way of life that they brought, I become curious about it. I become open. I want to explore. I want to ask, why do I do it this way and they do it that way? And so it is this, what Mesereau described as critically examining a prior interpretation to revise or create new meaning of our experience in order to guide our future action. So that's how I'm thinking about transformative learning in this situation. And it does involve what we often talk about as critical reflection. Many people use these words, and yet we probably always mean something slightly different when we use them. And so I want to contrast the idea of critical reflection with the idea of simple reflection. So you probably, each of you here who are listening to us, probably have a favorite sport. My favorite sport is tennis. And I bore poor Alessandra and Claudio with discussions of the latest tennis plays, when we're together. But in tennis or in soccer or any of the sports that you're interested in watching, if you're watching them on television, we have come accustomed to simple reflection. When there is a great play or a bad play or a significant play, what happens? The television stops, they roll back to that moment, and they play it again and often slow it down so that we can reflect on it. We can see what happened. We can see what that person did. How did they hold that racket? What caused that ball to go in one direction rather than another? And so we look back and we understand what happened and what is the cause and effect chain that resulted in what it is that we were doing. That's simple reflection, to understand that, to see that. And that's extremely valuable. And I would say that many of us don't do it frequently enough. And when we are helping people learn, just helping them to simply reflect is sometimes a big challenge. And yet it is the stop and think that often leads people to say, well, I could do that a different way. It doesn't have to be done that way. Let me try this other thing. So simple reflection leads to what some of you who may study in the organizational field have come up against, something called single loop learning. A single loop is a single feedback loop where when we do something, we get a result, and that result either reinforces or contradicts something else that we started out with. And so we either stop and say, I have to do it differently if I'm going to get the result I want, or we don't stop and think and we just keep doing it again and again. My colleague Karen Watkins, who Alessandra mentioned, she uses the example of trying to get your motorbike or your car to start when it's cold outside or bad weather, and you put the key in the lock and you turn it and it doesn't turn over. And so what do? Well, most of us just go back and try it again and again and again, and it still doesn't turn over. And so we have to stop and we have to ask, what is going on here? I must do something different. And that is the act of critical reflection. A critical reflection is when we, as John Dewey said it, and Mesereau relied on John Dewey a lot, is the active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in light of the grounds that support it and the future conclusions to which it tends. So that simply means is that we look at it and we ask ourselves, well, what really is causing this? Is it for example, if you're learning to be an educator in schools and you're in the classroom and a child is disruptive, the first thing you might think is, I'm not very good at teaching yet, I'm still learning, and I don't have the right behavioral management technique. So instead of doing this, I'm going to do that. Instead of punishing this child, I'm going to give him a different kind of reward, or I'm going to put him in a different group. These are single loop or simple reflection solutions. But we may have to stop and ask deeper questions that have to do with, for example, what did that child encounter at home before he came to the classroom or she came to the classroom? What's their home life like? And is the problem deeper than simply something that's happening in this classroom? Then we're beginning to ask ourselves, what's really behind this and how can I really support change? So Mesereau developed a process to describe this and understand it. And I just want to say a word about the context within which he developed it, because that influences a lot what we have here. He studied programs where women would go back to college after they had stopped school, they finished their early grades, and they began to have families and they raised their children. And when they finished raising their children, they said, well, what else is there for me in my life? And they wanted to do something different. But at the time he studied it, it was not very usual for adults of older ages to go back to college. And so the idea that I, as a woman who's raised a family, feel that I can go back at college and learn something different and make myself into a different person and create a new life for me was very unusual. And Jack knew this because his wife had gone back to school. She went back to college, and he saw the suffering that she had around her own self-image and whether or not she could do this. He also saw that some of the faculty, some of her teachers were able to take extra time to help her and other women who were going back to really understand how to be successful and to change their view of themselves from someone who did, I don't belong here in this college, to yes, I belong here and I can do this and I really can be successful. And that process is what I'll just briefly explain. And so he developed that process by looking at these programs in many colleges across the United States. I happened to be very fortunate at the time to be a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley, and I knew Jack from some prior work. And so I got to do the interviews for people in the Northern California area. So I get in my little car, I had a little convertible, drive on the highways of California and go around and visit community colleges and visit these programs, which was wonderful. Anyway, so he developed this based on understanding and looking at the lives of women going through these programs. And as was said earlier, the change really started with some kind of unexpected disorienting event. And this didn't happen suddenly, although the model seems to show that it comes upon us suddenly, and it can. But it actually, for many women, happened over time because their children left their homes, they wanted to do something else. They began to feel that they didn't have a role anymore. What they were valued for was child raising, and now they weren't doing that, and they began to feel incompetent. And so over time, they had this dilemma. And so the other women who were feeling this set up these programs for re-entering into college. And in these programs, both in classrooms and in social situations, women learn skills that help them to really think through and transform their view of who they were and what they could do. And one of the things that was most powerful about these programs is the social side. Jack didn't write as much about the social side, but I was always impressed when I did the research to find that there was a women's lounge. And in this women's lounge were a lot of the women would spend their time there. They would, in between classes, they would help one another. They would sometimes bring their kids. They would get advice. They would talk about the challenges they were facing. And so the social environment for their transformation was a very positive and collective social environment. And within that, they talked to one another informally. Some of this happened in classrooms, but a lot of it happened through their interaction and through meeting with different people and finding out that other people thought differently. Other people did it different ways. So they looked at what they were doing. They understood what other people were doing who approached things differently. And they began to change their point of view in different ways about their success as an academic and being able to make it through school, and also about the opportunities that they might have and the role that they might play with their newly found skills. And so they really were involved in transforming their frame of reference about who they were, what they could do, and the skills that they had. And the programs also took the next step and helped them to act on that. So oftentimes in education, we stop with changed points of view. Changed points of view are not enough because most of the challenge comes in putting that changed point of view into action. And so it's the starting point. If we don't change our view, we won't start. But if we don't follow through and try things out in new ways, we won't transform really, because we encounter difficulties that we have to work through along the way. And so exploring options, planning next steps, trying on new roles, trying things out and doing role playing to see what happens around that, help them to gain confidence in their new points of view, and also help them plan for how they were going to continue to get help and support once they left the college. So Jack laid this process out, and it had much research has confirmed that it often is a process that maybe not all of these steps, but the core processes in these steps are steps that held up. So just as I think about that, it leads us to this question, which I think the project is also about that you're involved in, which is how do we help people by learning about it, right? How do we educate people for this? And as I've studied and read about what other people are doing around this and looked at what we have done, it's clear that there are some important things about how to design such learning, but it's not good enough just to see what other people did and simply transplant them into your environment. It really requires a lot of different kinds of effort, because once you start opening these points of view up, it leads to often uncomfortable situations, because people are vulnerable. You know, when you start talking about your identity and you talk about who you are and what experiences you've had, you need to realize that other people, you want other people to be accepting of who you are and not critical. You want people to be welcoming and supportive. My colleague, our colleague, Amra's and mine, Ellie Drago Severson, who does a lot of work from the developmental perspective, she talks about a holding environment which comes from the literature on Bowlby and on, on fundamental childhood development. But a holding environment is one where we do provide support, but we also provide challenge. And I think this idea of challenge and support is very akin to this difference between a safe space and a brave space that people have been talking about. Because it's a safe space if you have support, but it's not going to get you to change if, in fact, you need to be able to put difficult things on the table and think them through, knowing that the people who are helping you do that care about you and are there to support you in the doing of it. And I thought this wonderful example that I read about in the handbook of transformative learning, the last one, Alessandra, you're working on the new one, the new handbook that's going to be coming out, yay. But this is Juanita Johnson Bailey's writing about positionality and transformative learning, and she tells the story of a study tour. So in the United States and in Europe, you travel a lot to different countries. In the United States, we travel sometimes within the United States, but not always outside. And in colleges, they've often incorporated study tours to help people get out of their culture and see things differently. And so this faculty member was taking a number of students on a study tour, and they happened to be in England, and they were in London and looking at the crown jewels displays in the Tower of London, etc. And she noticed that two of her girls were in front of the display of the crown jewels, and it was such a moving experience to them. They were both crying. And one of the girls was a white woman, and another girl was an African-American woman. So in the evenings, they would debrief the experiences they had during the day. And she asked these two girls, well, I noticed you were both looking at the jewels and both of you were moved to tears. She thought they had a common experience that was causing them to cry. But when the girls explained why they cried, it was a totally different perspective that each held. The white woman, her family had some roots in the culture of England and came over in some of the early settlers. And she was crying because of the beauty of the jewels and the traditions that are behind the royalty and about the history of her family and things of that sort. And so coming face to face with that just moved her to think positively about her roots. The African-American woman thought about the slave trade, and she thought, my goodness sakes, in Africa, they plundered, they killed, they exploited just for jewels to put on the head of a person in the royalty. What a tragedy. And so the girls' experiences were very, very different. And the faculty had to create an environment for that to be shared and for us all to learn from that, who were with them in that moment. And so transformative learning doesn't always have to be that difficult, but it often comes to a point where we need environments where we can be both safe and brave, and where we do feel comfortable supporting the discussions that need to happen in order to, in the case of, as Amra is going to be talking about, it, de-radicalize in an educational space. This is not an easy thing to do. So we need to have environments that, have strategies in facilitation, and we do know things about what those are. We can talk about them in the question and answers later on if you'd like. It very much involves on having the right kind of learning community, where there's a lot of peer support, there's a lot of perspective sharing, where there's able to be a brave space and enough trust to be able to feel that you can process the difficult experiences, not only from your past, but in the present. Because in the present, we are encountering one another, and we may be holding back what we really think, but communicating that in one or other way, in any case, through our body language. So that is kind of the foundational pieces that I'm setting here. And I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Amra, and we'll listen to her. And if there's some time at the other side, I would like to just have some reflections on how we're beginning to think about the other piece of this, which is the piece that has to do with how societies transform along with individuals. What's that interaction look like, and how can we begin to understand what's a framework for thinking about that? So I'm going to stop my share. If I can here. Okay. Now, how do I stop sharing? Stop sharing. Okay. Good.
Thank you, Victoria. That was incredibly informative, and I think everyone who is here with us today is deeply grateful to you for setting that foundation. I am going to ask Alessandra to share slides because we had some technical difficulties with me controlling them, and hopefully that will not impede our presentation today.
Okay, can you just confirm that you are able to see my screen and your presentation?
I can see it. Fantastic. Yeah. And I assume there's no way for me to control it, but you'll switch the slides for me, correct? Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here. I am going to continue where Victoria left off, and I'm going to really today try to bring together different bodies of work of literature and projects that I have been involved in that really connect seemingly unrelated areas of my work. And you will travel through that journey with me through some questions that I hope you will be willing to engage in. I know this is a large group, but it is important that there is a participatory element coming from your end through our activities and work today as well. So I will talk about the importance of storytelling in transformative learning and how all of that connects to radicalization. And next up. And I will begin by reading a segment from The Cat I Never Named, which is a memoir. It is nonfiction book that I had written about my own experience of growing up in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the town of Bihać, living under the military siege by the Serb forces for nearly 4 years, being cut off from the rest of the world. And really in that book, I explore many concepts and issues that relate to transformative learning and transformative journey that Victoria has talked about, and that are really relevant to the issues of exclusion, hatred, marginalization, discrimination, education, and Islamophobia, which are all of the areas that I focus on. And that reading will really bring us or connect us to this theory that I have been developing, or a model that I have been developing that is based on 50 interviews with radicalized individuals, ultra-conservative individuals in post-war Bosnia, that I call educational displacement and replacement model of radicalization. And as we cover some of that, model and discuss it, we will then bring ourselves into this sort of final piece of work that I've done over the last couple of months. It is still ongoing. It is really applied research, a project called Voices, which stands for Venture to Overcome Intolerance and Counter Extremism in Schools, which is a professional training opportunity that I had developed with my graduate students. In fact, as a project within a course here at Teachers College at Columbia University, where we worked with the United States government, specifically Department of Homeland Security's Office for Prevention of Extremism and Targeted Violence, to create a new way or a model of mitigating risks and amplifying what we call protective factors against targeted violence and radicalization of students in the United States. I don't think I need to spend much time convincing you why it's important that we do this work. I think the question of what is happening in our societies in terms of mass radicalization, whether in the United States or throughout the Europe and beyond, is an open question that no one has been able to quite fully understand because of all of the complexities that Victoria has already talked about and that I will be touching upon through this work. And then hopefully if we have time, I feel like we always, when we have these conversations, we always run out of time. So my hope is that we will continue this collaboration and work in the future. But hopefully Victoria and I and everyone else will be able to engage in a conversation. But with this, I am going to start reading from or share a scene from The Cat I Never Named that will really begin our conversation and discussion. I'm going to ask Alessandra if she wants to stop sharing for a second, since I'm going to be reading for a few minutes. That is okay as well, and then we can continue with the next slides. Then I hear a whistling overhead, a thin, reedy sound. An instant later, I see a flash as a missile hits a house on the bank of Una. On my home side of the bridge, the sound of the explosion comes an instant later, and I stand frozen, bizarrely thinking about physics, about the relative speed of light and sound that cleaves the experience in two. First, the sight of fire and flame, then disconnected by a second or two, sound waves that roll over me like messengers eager to bear bad news. I hear another missile overhead, launched from the mountains surrounding our town. Someone told Tata, who told me in turn, the bomb that you hear is not the one with your name on it. If you hear it whistle, it is because it's flying over your head to somewhere else. You never hear a whisper from the bomb that kills you. The air raid siren starts in its high-pitched howl then. We have no radar, nothing to tell us that the missiles are inbound. So the siren is a joke. It just serves to remind us that people are being killed. It gives no warning, just wails and mourns with the rest of us. Davor and I find each other again. We're still frozen in place, not knowing if we're about to die, but our eyes meet across the bridge. Between us, I see the mother and her little boy, the girl in the green sweater, a trio of middle-aged women who look like sisters. Davor takes a step toward me. Then the air seems to be sucked out of the world as I'm hit with an earth-shattering, deafening explosion. There's a flash between Davor and me, and I'm blinded. Metal and stone are flying around me. I turn to run, and it's only when my legs are moving that I realize I am not dead. I only make it a few steps before I fall, scraping my knees. In the dust and chaos, I hear screams, and I drag myself to my feet, stunned. My ears are ringing, and the air is choked with dust. I smell smoke. I taste smoke. There's grit on my tongue. The blue bridge is still standing. The bomb struck a glancing blow that didn't do anything much to the structure. But the pedestrians on the bridge. Against every survival instinct, I make myself walk back toward the other end of the bridge. I look all around. but don't see Davor. The little boy, the one who wanted to look at fish over the side of the bridge, is standing in the middle of a cloud of masonry dust. His mouth is open, and at first I think the sound he's making is part of the loud ringing in my ears, because everything sounds weirdly muffled at first. The sounds are returning to my ears one at a time. Then I realize he's screaming a long, drawn out, terrible cry that stops only when he's out of breath, then starts again after a ragged gasp. I go to him. He's blonde, tussle-haired, and blue-eyed, just like Dino when he was younger. But his little face looks impossibly old. I wish he could be confused. I wish he didn't know exactly what just happened. But this little boy understands his loss, and he's suffused with helpless, inarticulate rage. I go to him, reach out my hand. He just stares at me with his prematurely aged face. I look beyond him. Blood on a stylish suit, the fox fur collar made from a whole fox, its sharp white teeth grinning as it grasps its own tail. Its black glass eyes are staring at me. Above that, nothing. There's nothing where his mother's head should be. He finds words now, and his screams turn into a desperate wail for his mother. He's not looking at her, but he must have seen. He's calling to her like his words could turn back time, undo the bomb, like if he begs the universe loudly enough, he can make his mother alive again. I take his little hand and he looks at me like I'm an alien thing. I try to lead him off the bridge, but he's like a boulder, immovable. All this time, he never stops screaming his feral fury against the world. An old man staggers beside us. A couple clings to each other as they walk through the smoke, though it's midday. The smoke and dust make it look like a foggy evening. Survivors are like ghosts in the haze. I still don't see Davor, not among the bodies or the survivors. The little boy's grief shatters me. There is nothing I can do. So I leave him. It's a wrenching decision, but someone will come to help him. I look at the other people on the bridge. The three middle-aged sisters are strewn about like old clothes. That's what I see. Their old lady sweaters and their sensible shoes. A man is hanging half of the bridge draped over the rail. Blood is dripping in a puddle at his feet. Then I see the girl in the green sweater like mine. She's on the ground, curled on her side, facing away from me. Her sweater is perfectly clean and tidy, like she just decided to take a nap in this odd place. I think she's unconscious. Maybe she was knocked out by the shock wave. I kneel at her side and take her shoulder, gently turning her over as I say, "Don't worry, I'm here. I'll help you." I roll her and find the bloody horror. The front of her body is stripped of clothes, stripped of skin, shredded from a hail of metal and stone shrapnel. From the front, she doesn't look human. She looks like meat. I scream and scramble backward on my hands and feet like a crab, wiping my bloody hands on the ground. They make a red paste with the dust. I roll to my knees, haul myself to my feet, look around for somebody, anybody who can do something. Suddenly there are lights up ahead, in the middle of the road where we're walking. It's a big square white lorry with tall blue letters on the side, UN. The United Nations is supposed to be here to help the suffering, to facilitate peace. With a gasp of relief, I run to meet the truck, waving my hand to stop them. "Help is here," I shout to the little boy as I pass him. "These men will help you." I'm standing in the middle of the road, right in the truck's path. It slows. The driver sees me. He meets my eye. "Please have medics," I think. "Please have some kind counselor who can take care of this poor child." Please have someone to compassionately tend to that poor girl's body to cover her ravaged face. But the UN truck swerves around me, increasing speed. Okay, I think. They're going to Wounded in the center of the bridge. But the truck doesn't stop. It drives fast enough to make the damaged bridge shake. It swerves carefully around the carnage and rubble and carries on as if dead Bosnians weren't sprawled on the streets. The world is watching and it doesn't care. Thank you, everyone. As both Victoria and Alessandra know, I have read this many, many times in the context of various conversations that I've had around the world, and it never gets easier for me. I always go through a moment of transformation every time I read it. But I'm going to ask Alessandra now to continue sharing my slides, and particularly the following slide that asks the question of why do you think that I had read this piece with you? It would be the next slide, Alessandra. Why do you think I shared this particular scene with you? Why does this moment in time matter? And how is it relevant? How is this work relevant in this moment to the discussions we're having today? Anyone?
May I?
Of course, of course.
I think that after such a traumatic and critical moment as the one that you live, many people in your place would become really angry at the world and would risk to become radical against enemies or against those who didn't help in a situation like that. And maybe you're bringing this to us because maybe you are the example of someone who didn't become radical and who works with radicalization and works with education and uses in a very positive way this traumatic experience.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that reflection, Marina. You are absolutely correct that in a way, by sharing this story, I invite a reader to go through a process of transformation and self-reflection and critical reflection, both simple and complicated aspects of transformative learning through this book, where in fact education played a critical role, and self-education, informal education, incidental learning that Victoria often talks about, have played a role in why I am today someone who speaks against hatred and radicalization and violence and othering and marginalization, rather than someone who could have potentially radicalized. And we'll talk about some of those examples. So thank you, Marina, for sharing that. Anyone else? Any additional thoughts? Okay, so we'll go to the next slide, Alessandra. As Marina really well captured it, the scene is a moment that reflects a type of experience that really can shake up our assumptions, or at least those who have survived, myself included, that we have about the world. For instance, the assumption that I had that the world would come and rescue us, that the world would not allow Bosnian Muslims to be executed in the way that brutally, in the way that we were, that something would change as a result of that targeted violence that we had experienced. This is a moment, an experience that really deconstructs everything that I knew about the world, and also our beliefs and feelings as a consequence of that deconstruction process can radically change. So I asked myself questions: is there good in the world? Should I believe in goodness of people? Should I believe in humanity? What should I really do in response to this? As Marina noted, there's certainly moments of anger. There are moments of temptation to hate back. There are moments of depression that I had experienced during the war, wondering, should I take up some form of violence to respond to this experience? Next, Alessandra. And in this process of self-reflection, it is not only those who are survivors, who survive this kind of experience, that really are impacted by it. There are also groups that are referentially impacted by these kinds of traumatic events. Think of, for instance, violence happening currently in the Middle East, and the kinds of protests and the kinds of reactions that that violence has produced in Europe, in the United States, with people who are not directly affected by the violence occurring in the Middle East as a region. Children of survivors, we know through intergenerational trauma, are always affected in various ways. Also, other communities that have watched Bosnian genocide take place, not only Muslim communities, but others as well, have been affected. Within Muslim communities, radicalization happened in response to watching the Bosnian genocide occur. One of the books that I often recommend is Ed Hussein's book, The Islamist, where he talks about his experience being Pakistani, being Pakistani Muslim in the UK, who then radicalizes as a result of various violence around the world. Next, Alessandra. Here's an example of actually someone from my hometown, a hometown of Bihać, whose entire family radicalized. Someone who actually grew up in my neighborhood, whose father and whose brother fought and died in Syria as radicalized extremists. And this particular individual had his entire life turned upside down. He was also imprisoned briefly as suspected terrorist. And so the question then becomes, I think, in our conversation today, how do we make sure that when events that are transformative, like the events that I experienced in the cat I never named, are the events that do not compel people to opt for hatred, radicalization, and violence? And that is something that we're going to discuss in the upcoming slides. Next, Alessandra. So a key component to radicalization process really requires this process of internal and belief transformation that is always associated with radicalization process. So through self-reflection, individual often arrives to a new sense of self, which leads to the construction of the old self and construction of a new identity, prompting a new set of actions and behaviors. Next. But irrespective of whether it's a foreign policy issue or experience of genocide that triggers one's transformation, the key really to whether an individual radicalizes or not is how does education respond to grievances of vulnerable youths? How and if education system decides to handle the young individual's grievances, traumas, and frustrations with exclusion, hate, and marginalization. For instance, the problem of educational system failing to address these kinds of grievances still exists in Bosnia, and I think puts Bosnia at the risk of engaging in another violence or conflict in the coming years because the formal educational system has failed to do that. Go ahead, Alessandra. It is ultimately the education system that can shape new frameworks of meaning, sense of belonging, moral framework, sense of self in relation to society. Next. And the key concept that I bring into this process is the idea of educational displacement. If educational and mainstream narrative does not allow for the critical examination of grievances or perpetuates exclusion, this is a moment where people begin, particularly young adults, begin to explore alternatives to what they're lacking in terms of address of grievances in the educational system. And so they become more susceptible and more likely to an exploration of those alternatives to really find threads of radicalization in informal spaces. So educational disengagement, or what I call displacement, is really a moment or opportune moment for radicalization to arise. Next. Educational displacement is nuanced, it is complex. It can manifest in the form of dropping out, but it can also be simply feeling silenced or feeling excluded from the conversation in the classroom, which is when an individual often begins to seek what we call replacement, social educational content that can really further undermine the mainstream education. What we do know from research is that narratives that undermine conformity or promote deviant behavior are the narratives that can actually help a person engage in criminal and extreme behavior. Next. In essence, when we fail to provide the educational space and content that addresses the grievances of at-risk population, marginalized groups, the alternative social educational content undermining the mainstream narrative is likely to fill the void. And this is really based on my model, based on my research, where radicalization begins. It begins when educational displacement starts. It does not begin when an individual is finding themselves online, searching internet, Twitter, Facebook, and looking for radicalized content. It actually begins prior to that, during this educational displacement moment. Next. And one element to the radicalization process that's really important for us to pay attention to is the idea of personal or associative grievances. In some cases, marginalized individuals begin to feel grievances that are associative as they start to identify with distant referential groups due to their personal marginalization. Again, an example that I shared with you of Ed Hussein, British-born, who experienced displacement because of his background in the UK educational system, who then associated his own personal grievances growing up with grievances of other groups, in particular Bosnian Muslims, and genocide that happened in Bosnia. Similarly, white supremacists, for instance, today in the West, associate themselves with Serb nationalists who committed genocide against Bosniaks in Bosnia. And white supremacists feel that the Serbs, in a way, protected and that they cleansed white Christian Europe by killing Bosniaks. They have their own fear. And again, whether that fear is real or perceived, whether it's seated in facts or not, is entirely irrelevant, because this is the perception that they have, that they, in a way, needed to displace Bosnian Muslims out of white Christian Europe in order to prevent, in a way, impurity that comes with Bosnian Muslim identity. Next. Another key factor in the radicalization model that we're talking about today is also the idea of mentorship. And the idea of mentorship, perhaps not in the constructive way that we often think of mentorship, but really the role of these mentors who are radicalizing extremist recruiters that exist in these informal spaces that really provide a personal touch through informal learning to individuals who are at risk, who are in the process of radicalization. And they're particularly important in deepening educational replacement. And so they're often the ones who provide the alternative content that enables individuals to fully radicalize. Next. For instance, Salafis in Bosnia provide what I call continuing informal, alternative, and non-conforming education for the marginalized, and operate via mentorship-based clinics and lecture spaces that have become their de facto schools. Often the assumption is that radicalization, when it comes to Muslims, happens in mosques or madrasas, in formal institutions. In some contexts, obviously radicalization is very complicated and context-driven. It does happen, but often Salafis, in fact, and specifically in Bosnia, create these informal spaces that they draw potentially radicalizing individuals into. So not necessarily in mosques, but sometimes they have conversion conferences. At times they will take over abandoned buildings and create lectures in those buildings. So a lot of radicalization that I had witnessed really happens in these informal adult learning spaces. Next. And the essential element to that process is curated content, online or in person. Again, depending on the context that we're talking about, depending on the level of the digital literacy within different populations, radicalization may happen more online or in person, or it could be a hybrid model. The key in the process is that the content is often curated, whether online or in person, by these influencers, by guides, by the mentors. And internet is really what allows individuals to group themselves into these self-isolating clusters that can help them radicalize. We've seen that bifurcation of views and ideologies in social media on a mass scale in the US and beyond. Twitter alone, for instance, accounts for about 40% of all extremist traffic online. Next. Another important step in the process is the idea of ideological identity, religious transformation. Again, I talked about religious transformation, but I think, as you know, and as Victoria had mentioned, any form of ideological identity transformation is involved often in radicalization process. There is a change that has to happen for a person to transform from a moderate individual to become a completely ultra-conservative, extreme, intolerant individual in their views. And to do that, there has to be the underlying process of, in the case of Salafis, religious ideological transformation. To give you an example, from a nearby town, near my hometown of Bihać, there was this young man whose name was Ibro, who grew up in a small village of Bujim, and who was actually a role model for others in this community. And even within the local mosque, people were collecting donations to help finance Ibro to attend university and study religion. Next. But after being influenced by one of the Salafi leaders in the community, Hussein Bilal Bosnic, Bosnian Salafi preacher, mentor, leader, Ibro fully transformed. He started to leave mosque early from prayers. He told local imam, "You don't have a clue about Islam." In fact, he even called his own father an infidel and said, "When you're dead, I won't pray for you because you are an infidel." Next. This is just a photo, a screenshot of Hussein Bilal Bosnic, one of those key Salafi voices who influenced Ibro during his arrest in Bosnia. Next. So in Ibro's example, what was interesting is that village residents actually talked about this magic power that Bosnic had to lure this young man and really transform and help him change very quickly. And what was really critical in that transformation was that Ibro's father shared that, in essence, a relationship of his son with Hussein Bilal Bosnic became this dominant relationship that Ibro was really dependent on. In fact, he said Ibro got to know Bosnic and moved in with him a short time later. In summer of 2014, he received military training, and then he was gone to Syria. To a certain extent, he was sold. And this really gets at the concept of maintaining exclusivity, which is extremely important in this process of radicalization, because to fully radicalize an individual needs to be engaged exclusively in contact and relationship only with those recruiters who are curating that content, who are changing perspectives in the view of the world of these individuals at risk for radicalization. Next. And perhaps the question to ask, how did they do it? How did these Salafi recruiters in Bosnia, how did they actually manage to maintain these dominant relationships? What happens? And what happens is that they give them individual attention. They give these young adults one-on-one sessions that are deeply personalized, in the radicalization process. Often these are individuals that haven't had a sense of belonging, a space where they could engage, and this kind of attention that they receive really becomes critical in undermining all other spaces, social educational alternatives that exist for these individuals. Next. And eventually they arrive at this sense of marginalized elitism. And the concept really refers to this idea that individuals who radicalize typically have felt that they existed in, or they were neglected or lacked recognition and belonging in the margins of the mainstream of society. And so as they go through the radicalization process, they for the first time begin to feel that they are special. Often Salafi mentors will maintain this idea that really they are the only ones who are true Muslims, that they're the only ones who truly follow Islam, and that everybody else is an infidel, including people like myself who have a Bosnian Muslim background. And so Salafis often, in my conversations with them, do not call themselves Salafis. They actually call themselves true Muslims, the only Muslims who follow the first followers in Islam. And that is the only important and valid referential group in Islam for them. And so this idea makes them feel special. It makes them feel different. They even behave or dress differently. When you walk on the streets in Bosnia, you can recognize who is a Salafi because they are trying to define themselves as this distinct group that is very special because of their presumed following of the initial and first followers of Islam. And that is a whole separate question of to what extent some of these interpretations are, in fact, completely wrong interpretations of Islam. Next. But the ultimate tipping point in the radicalization process is really achieved when radicalized groups get young adults and adults to a point of self-exclusion, meaning deliberate marginalization, where these individuals no longer have any interest in engaging with the mainstream society, where they want to retain their position in the margins of the society long term. And so once this deliberate marginalization, self-exclusion takes place, it becomes much more difficult for us to engage in any process of de-radicalization. Any other prior step in the radicalization process actually provides more opportune spaces for engagement, stopping, interrupting radicalization process. But once they deliberately marginalize, it becomes much more difficult. For instance, in Bosnia, there are certain villages or very small communities where only Salafis live. They do not want to interact or engage with the outside world. And here I'm going to underline, we can talk about Salafism if we have time for questions more, but I want to underline that not all Salafis are militant. There's a very small segment of Salafis that become militant. What we do know, and what I often say, is that not all Salafis are extremists, but it tends to be the case that all extremists who radicalize in the name of Islam have some thread or a link that links them to Salafi ideology, because it is extremely ultra-conservative, it is extremely intolerant towards other views, and therefore makes this group more susceptible towards becoming militant or members of militant groups in the name of religion. Next. And so in short, I just want to highlight here that radicalization is really achieved through this process, as I call it, of educational displacement. Educational displacement from formal institutions that no longer hold the interest or are capable or have capacity or training to address grievances that may arise with the individuals at risk for potential violence. And that educational displacement then is followed by essentially the process that I had outlined of educational replacement, where radicalizing and extremist recruiters who reside in these informal spaces tend to look for individuals who are at risk and tend to then engage in this process of cultivation that ultimately leads to full radicalization. Next. And this is just another representation of the several slides that we have gone over that really outlines this process, starting with educational displacement, points to the importance of personal associative grievances, seeking mentor refuge that then enables these individuals to curate content for the potentially radicalizing at-risk marginalized individuals, whether youths or adults. And then the next step of religious identity transformation or ideological transformation that ultimately leads to this feeling of being a marginalized elite. And once an individual gets to a point where they feel they have transformed from being a nobody or lacking a sense of belonging in the mainstream society to being somebody or being a member of this special group, that is a moment where we're at risk for them maintaining really exclusive relationship only with the members of their community that is working on radicalizing these individuals. And at that point, when an individual gets to a feeling of wanting to self-exclude and deliberately marginalize and deliberately disengage from the mainstream society, that is really when we have a problem of full radicalization process being achieved, being completed. And it is at that point that militancy is often explored. Next. And so what I would like to do is actually, these are next few lines are citations or segments from the transcripts with my of the interviews with Salafi individuals, and I would like for you to engage with me here to really with each line kind of think about where do you think a shared view based on their own words fits within the educational displacement model. So the first thing that I want to share is that we might assume, based on these individuals' radicalization, that they do not care about education. However, I have repeatedly found that education is actually very important to them. They will repeatedly say that education is ordered in life after religion. And again, this is in the words of one of those Salafis. But the question really that we should be asking is, what do they consider as education? What do they feel is a learning process? What do they experience as a learning process? And that is, I think, where our perspectives entirely diverge. And so here's one citation. I would like you to place it along the radicalization model that we had just shared. I do not discuss religion with peers, no discussion with others, even family is unimportant unless they practice Salafism like my wife and mother. And Alessandra, if you could just go back to previous slide. and so this slide, where would you place that statement? Where's that person based on their perspective along this journey of radicalization?
Well, I can try maybe about mental refugee and deepening educational replacement.
Definitely that process has already taken place for this person, right? If we're thinking about this individual as saying, I'm not interested in talking to anyone but those who share my view, they not only are undergoing the process of existing in that alternative radicalizing space, but they're likely in this process or stage of maintaining exclusivity, meaning that I'm already deeply into this process. And unless you share my perspective, even if you are my family member, I have no desire to interact or engage with you. Let's go to the slide again, Alessandra, to the next statement. In terms of importance, mosques are not organized at all mosques have nothing to offer to Salafis, so they are unimportant. Again, if we go back to the next previous slide, where would you place this person along the trajectory towards full radicalization? Think of mosques as institutions. I see some comments, marginalized elitism. Absolutely, but also where the statement is relevant is the beginning of the process of educational displacement, where this individual is saying, I don't want formal institutions anymore. Whereas in the sort of Western societies, Western context, we presume that often, and there's this myth that radicalization always happens in mosques. In fact, what I had found is that Salafis in Bosnia, at least, are completely disengaging and displacing themselves from the formal institutional version of Islam that is tolerant, that is accepting, that exists in Bosnia. And so it is really a sign or signal that educational displacement is happening, not only from mainstream non-religious institutions, but also from the religious institutions that we ordinarily would see as spaces of intervention. If we can go back to the next statement. And I apologize for the delay. I wish this was more natural, but I don't unfortunately have the ability to control my slides. Mentors are most important. It is very important for Muslims who get up in the morning to go to work, whoever works. If you don't have time to study Islam yourself, to call someone who traveled that path and who knows about that topic. You call people of knowledge and faith and inform yourself from them on how to form your own positions. Previous slide. So where would you place this person, this statement, or this perspective? What do they think is important? Anyone? What's the key word that they're using? Mentor, refuge, deepening. Excellent. So this person, if we go back to the model, is talking about you need this outside outside of the formal system interventionist, if you will. You need this guide, this mentor, somebody who has this knowledge that is going to replace the vacuum that you find elsewhere. And so I think what we often assume is about radicalized individuals, that they are actually not on this journey to learn. What I had found is that, in fact, the entire radicalization process is a journey of learning, exploration, and transformation. And so if we can capitalize on that need and look for spaces and moments of interruption along this path and offer alternatives for the de-radicalization, I think we could be successful in a way, leveraging the model that Salafis use to radicalize individuals. So if we could go to the next slide, Alexandra. Let's go to the next page. So here's another important statement, and I actually said it on a separate slide because I think it requires broader self-reflection for all of us. In my world, and so this is another Salafi says, in my world, reliance on peers, mentors is very important. It is what is said. It is not what is said, but who said it that is important. Whoever I consider as trusting, I can take their information as accurate. Where have we seen these views beyond Salafism? Where are we seeing it in our societies today? Trump. We're seeing this on a mass scale. So we're seeing these tendencies that I have recognized seemingly within very isolated, small subsegment of population. And by the way, if you look at some of the Pew research globally, Bosnian Muslims are deemed to be statistically the most tolerant group of Muslims in the world. In fact, I would argue much more tolerant and much more liberal than many other seemingly more liberal or presumed to be more liberal contexts. And yet Salafis were able to see themselves in that kind of tolerant environment and inclusive environment, at least based on the perspectives that Bosnian Muslims tend to hold. And so this kind of process that I had recognized with Salafis is something that I see resembling the mass movement towards radicalization here, domestic radicalization in the United States, where it's really become that it doesn't matter what the facts and truths are, what the reality is, that we tend to associate ourselves with those individuals and trust those individuals and be loyal to those platforms of knowledge, information, and learning that are associated with leaders that we blindly believe in. And obviously, reflecting on the fact that nearly 80 plus million people voted for Donald Trump in the last election speaks volumes to the scale, volume in terms of the scale to which this is occurring. So, next slide. I'm going to suggest for you, before I move to the next segment of my lecture, some recommended readings. Obviously, I would recommend that you read The Cat I Never Named, because it handles many of these complicated issues in a very different way through storytelling. I am publishing in the coming months, it should be coming out, a piece on how people radicalize based on this model in the International Journal of Educational Development, so be on the lookout for that. I recently wrote a piece comparing essentially this model of radicalization to what's happening in the United States. So the title, The Scary Truth About Student Radicalization, It Can Happen Here. Next. There's also a piece that I think is important for those of you who are particularly interested in Islam or religion in general, to look at a study that I did, looking really analyzing historically more than 1,000 years of history of Islam, and looking at the shifts in knowledge and education and perceptions of knowledge and education throughout Muslim communities throughout history, and really offers some important insights of why we might be seeing radicalization around the world that we're seeing today within Muslim communities. And then there's an older piece that I had written for Huffington Post, Who Gets Radicalized, What I Learned from My Interviews with Extremist Disciples, that might be also of interest. Next. What I really want to focus now on is, how have I applied this model of radicalization and this work in a very specific context, very specific to the Salafi community, to some of the work that I am exploring now in the United States, given transformative experiences that we as a society have had over the last couple of years. And so this project is called Voices, Venture to Overcome Intolerance and Counter Extremism in Schools. And you can check out the website, voicesamplify.org. The project is really centered on applying and testing this theory in the US context, specifically in the context of education. Throughout all levels of education, we worked with educators, education professionals, to really offer a professional training to them on some of these issues relating to extremism, why radicalization happens, to see if we can actually shift their views and perspectives that they currently hold. Next. So I am going to just go over a couple of what we call competencies that we hope to develop and that we believe we have developed as part of this training. And then I will give you an example or two of how that played out in the actual training. So educational replacement radicalization theory that we just discussed, which essentially argues that radicalization of thoughts and beliefs typically stems from marginalization, isolation, lack of belonging, grievances, that typically happens in educational spaces. And so in the course, in Voices, participants are essentially trained on how to identify critical steps and precursors that can be attributed to student displacement and disconnection with the potential to lead to radicalization. So if teachers and educators in their formal spaces can essentially recognize when educational displacement is occurring, our hope is that we can offer tools based on what we know about this model of radicalization, to offer tools to teachers to actually counter those dynamics. Next. Here's just one activity as an example. I won't show the video because this particular video takes about 20 minutes. This is Christian Piccolini, who actually became radicalized white supremacist. In fact, one of the leaders, neo-Nazi leaders here in the United States. What we do, we ask educators to actually sequence his own story after listening to him tell his story of how he radicalized, and really find commonalities or linkages to educational displacement replacement model of radicalization. And we asked them to match what he said to each stage. And you can actually see, and what kind of realization happens with this exercise is that educators realize that the story or the model of educational displacement and replacement theory of radicalization actually fits perfectly well with the story of someone who is a white supremacist. There's a connective tissue between different forms of extremism that happen around the world. Next. Another relevant competency that we focus on is fostering inclusivity and tolerance. Obviously, lack of inclusivity and belonging in schools may cause various negative educational social outcomes for students. Fostering inclusivity improves educational outcomes, as well as both student and teacher well-being. In the course, participants actually reflect on their classroom management strategies, and we offer ways for them to mitigate biases and explore approaches to improve inclusivity and tolerance in the classroom. Next. Here's what we do, for instance, in one of the modules. At the beginning, we actually ask everyone to reflect on their own positionality in the classroom or workplace, which is extremely important, because recognizing where we come from, what are the experiences and frameworks that define how we act in our workplace or in our personal life is extremely important, having that self-awareness. So fostering tolerance and inclusivity really requires self-awareness of our own positionality. And here's what one of the teachers, one of the educators said. In the classroom, it has been difficult for me to get over my positionality in regards to the behavior of students of color. While I truly believe that all students are intelligent and capable in their own ways, I find myself leaning back on the notion that students of color are more disruptive in the classroom, are harder to handle. And while I know the sociological reasons behind their behavior, behind the privileged behavior that the school setting requires, I still find myself leaning back on my positionality. And I would like you to take a moment to think about your own background, your own beliefs, your own views, your own privilege or lack of privilege, to come up with answers to two questions. And I hope some of you will feel that this is a brave space where you can share them with us. What is your positionality in this world and in your workplace? In what ways does your positionality affect your work and your interactions with others? If you could reflect for a second, and let's see if anyone is willing to share, either through chat or just by unmuting themselves. Anyone? What do you think about when you think about defining your own positionality and how you do your work? Um, uh, how does your background, how does who you are and how you think impact the work that you do? So Victoria says,
I was reflecting on, my positionality as a professor. And many of you know I'm studying formal learning because I myself feel much more comfortable in informal situations, which reduces power distance, right? It makes us, more casual and more open to one another. And so I find often that, we talk about systemic racism, right? So systemically, the position of professor puts us at a disadvantage from what we really would like to do, which is to have authentic conversations with people. Because people think of, oh, I can't say that, that's my professor, and somehow that's going to get held against me, or I will feel embarrassed or whatever. And in some ways, I, as a professor, may be unconsciously sending messages that, I'm the professor. I may not think I am, but because I've been socialized into that role, I may be doing that. So Chris Argyris always says, we set things up in a way that we can't get what we really want, which is a real opportunity to have authentic conversations with our students. And maybe that's why we go out for a beer or a glass of wine after class. Those authentic conversations.
And I would add to that in addition to this individual struggle, I think your reflection actually, Victoria, connects to the larger societal setting where even if we want to lessen that distance as professors in our classrooms and create more collaborative, inclusive environment, it is the structures that exist in our society that clearly signal and communicate this institutionalized power that we're affiliated with that can be intimidating irrespective of the kind of work or effort we make in the classroom. And so I appreciate you sharing that. And Alessandra, if we could go back to the slides. And while we're waiting, anyone else wants to share? Well, I hope you'll do that exercise with yourselves, because I think it's an important one. But as you can tell, it is a difficult one for us to admit to ourselves where we are in relation to the power structures, certainly, and the power play that might happen in the classroom or workplace or in any other context. Next. But what we do know is that once educators and professionals are actually asked to self-reflect on their own positionality, they are more likely to recognize held unconscious or implicit biases. And those are the ones that we try to address through this particular training, voices that we have developed. And two, they're more willing to actively address them. Next. Another competence that we focus on developing that's very important, particularly for educators working in formal educational settings, is learning through storytelling and experience sharing. Participants in this process, in this training, learn through the experiences of scholars. We bring in writers, educators in the fields of psychology, philosophy of education, anti-bias scholarship. And as a result, there was a deepening of really the practice of sharing and critical reflection of their own experiences and experiences of fellow educators taking the Voices courses. One of the things that we've done, even though it's an online training that can be self-guided, done on your own time, we actually offered spaces where educators can begin to build a community and exchange their ideas, their feelings, and learn from each other. Next. In the process, we also used storytelling to evoke collective empathy and build moral resilience to violence. As an example that I had given you earlier today by sharing some of the reading from my book, it becomes very difficult to hate or other a person once you have meaningfully listened to them and heard their story. Some of the feedback that we've gotten is that I I learned so much about countering biases in the classroom from this course. Every activity was thoughtful and engaging. Listening to voices experts was memorable. I learned that moral resilience includes both the courage to ask questions and to sit down and listen with kindness. Next. This idea of moral resilience is extremely important, and the idea of social connectedness that we also work to build with voices, largely because there's so many narratives out there that counter different points of view. We mentioned Trump and Trumpism. There's so many stories that one could share, but those who are firmly trusting and loyal to that kind of leadership might not be really swayed to change their perspective. So simply producing many countering narratives doesn't actually work, or it does not work alone. It is not. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient to counter radicalization. What we actually do with voices is we build moral resilience to radicalizing narratives, because moral education encourages cooperative learning. It actually prevents moral disengagement, which is very important in interrupting radicalization. For a person to commit an act of violence against someone else, other group that is innocent, they have to dehumanize that group. They have to morally disengage from that violent extremist act in order to do that. And so preventing moral disengagement and keeping people connected and morally reflective and engaged is extremely important in preventing terrorism, preventing any kind of targeted violence, because the radicalized individuals tend to use narratives to justify violence through moral frameworks. They, in fact, reframe the act of killing of an innocent person as the right thing to do, as a moral thing to do. And so preventing that moral disengagement is critically important. Next. Here's another competence that we focus on: nonviolent problem solving. Violence appears in various forms, can similarly manifest in numerous ways in schools. In the course, participants analyze different types of violence, methods to mitigate them, and cultivate transformative practices to improve tolerance, understanding, and inclusivity. Next. So what is one of the things that we actually focus on? And again, this is just to your left, you're seeing a screenshot from our training. We actually explore these interconnections of violence. What is often not well understood, including amongst educators, is that there are varied forms of violence that we need to address. For instance, narratives that justify and promote war, genocide, othering, dehumanization, exclusion, racism, inequality, extreme ideologies, racial, ethnic, religious domination, hate, all of them constitute a form of what Johan Galtung called cultural violence. He's done a lot of work on structural, direct, and cultural violence, and you can see this sort of tree that explains how the three forms are interconnected. In essence, it is these narratives that are part of cultural frameworks, educational learning frameworks, that perpetuate the ideas that enable structural violence, like institutionalized or structural racism. And then as a result, direct violence emerges. So sort of the blood-related violence is the final almost symptom of other forms of violence that that are perpetuated daily in our societies. Next. And so this is just, capturing in a moment what we do throughout the entire training is we try in different ways to capture where are the educators that are going through this training, so that we can actually see what is their own process of learning and transformation throughout. And so there are many of those points and little quizzes and engagement activities throughout the training. But what we know is that those who took the training were actually not aware that bias is a type of violence. Only 20% thought bias is a form of cultural violence. And after the training, 80% agree with the idea that, in fact, yes, this is an important form of violence. We also realized that about 85% of course enrollees were able to actually, after this training, to link behavioral patterns and recognize them and link them to definitions of violence after completing relevant modules that really educated them on impact of different forms of violence in the classroom. And what I want to highlight here is that this was only a pilot project. We actually only spent 10 days promoting it, if you will, or marketing it to educators. We had hundreds of educators who participated in different ways, in different aspects of it. And what I find fascinating here and really telling is that these are educators who were interested in taking this training. So these were the educators who were not assigned or required by the institution to go through this kind of training. So this was somebody who had already thought of these issues and wanted to self-educate. And within that group, we're getting only 20% of people who are actually aware of the consequential impact that cultural forms of violence might have in ultimately creating direct forms of violence, targeted violence, extremism, and radicalization in our society. So I just want you to digest that fact for a moment. And I would suspect that these numbers would be very different if we had a broader participation, which we intend to have once this is officially launched as an online course that all of you will be able to take starting in November of this year through Columbia. Next. Increased understanding of Muslim beliefs and values. We actually, in this training, this was a pilot training, we focused on addressing a number of different forms of biases, but based on some of the preliminary data of surveying educators, we decided to actually develop a specific module or subset of lessons relating to understanding Muslim beliefs and values because Islamophobia seems to be so prevalent. Our hope is that as we further develop this training, that we will have modules for different types of biases within the larger framework. But what we do know is that increasing knowledge of the values and beliefs of Islam can actually help increase religious, ethnic, racial tolerance towards those who practice not only this faith, but all faiths. And so educators cannot actually effectively mitigate biases among their own students if they do not themselves fully understand and address their own biases. And so within the course, we actually review participants' own understanding of Islam, Islamic values, beliefs, and then obviously offer lessons after which we then test changes and shifts in attitudes, biases, and the knowledge base relating to Islam. Next. And here are some of the findings that I think you will find interesting. What did education professionals say about the prevalence of anti-Muslim bias? 92% of respondents hear negative information shared about Islam from the media. Now, if you self-reflect for a moment on the extent to which the negative information is present in the media, how can one, in fact, on an individual level, without exploring critical, important, and difficult conversation, begin to self-transform in what they might think about Islam based on the prevalence of the information in the media that is mostly negative. Next. 77% of respondents have never engaged in a professional development initiative aimed at addressing anti-Muslim bias. 86% of respondents hear negative information shared about Islam often. Again, part of the issue is that we, within the education system, are not countering the negative narratives that exist. We're not offering the knowledge base and information that might shift people's attitudes and change the prevalency of anti-Muslim bias globally. Next. 68% of respondents hear or see anti-Muslim bias occurring at their schools by their students. And here's an important one. 92% of respondents hear or see anti-Muslim bias occurring at their schools by their colleagues. Think of that for a second. This was, I'm going to self-reflect here on my own positionality as a genocide survivor, as a Bosnian Muslim. This brought me to tears. I'm a scholar, but I'm also a human being. And to be aware that 92% of educators who responded recognized this bias amongst their own colleagues, how can we in fact expect anything transformational to occur in the classroom if this is the kind of perspective that is brought into the schools and the classrooms? And so to me, these statistics are incredibly powerful in telling us how much work there is for transformational learning community around the world in terms of the, and again, this is only one bias that we selected because of the prevalence of this bias, but this has to be done with so many other biases that we experience in our societies. Next. And this is just, again, as I said, there are many of the check-in points where we try to track what has changed with the knowledge base or attitudes or understanding, in this case of Islam, among the participants. And we essentially asked them, where are they on the scale between strongly disagreeing or strongly agreeing with the particular statement that we make? And these statements were selected based on the biases that are prevalently held in relation to Muslims. And so Muslims live in diverse regions of the world and are diverse in their ethnic and racial backgrounds, as well as in the extent of their religiosity. This is something that's not a prevalent perspective or well known. All of the participants, in essence, agreed with the statement. Muslim women can dress moderately without covering their hair and their faces. Again, a significant improvement from where they were prior to engaging in this activity. Muslim women can be financially independent. Islam is in harmony with science. Muslims, including women, can be scientists and scholars. And particularly this relationship between knowledge and science, I would recommend that piece that I had published in 2020 that historically reviews the evolution and the relationship between Islam Muslim communities and the ideas of rational thinking and science and critical thinking, that I think is very important for anyone who is interested in understanding anti-Muslim bias today. Islam promotes multiculturalism, coexistence, respect of other religions or unbelievers. Islam is compatible with the US culture and values, and Islam promotes democracy and human rights. Islam does not support 9/11 attacks or any type of violent extremism. Islam respects diversity and LGBTQ's communities' rights. All of these ideas are tackled in various ways throughout the entire training, where we actually engage educators into a content that ranges in terms of disciplinary focus. Some of the work is related to psychology. Some of the work is related to arts and music, so that we tackle these issues from various perspectives to see if we can actually achieve shift in attitudes, which I think, at least based on the data from the pilot, we have been able to successfully do. Next. What I'm also happy to share is that Voices has been recognized by the US government. We were actually part of, my students and I, my students who worked on this project and I were part of what's called Invent to Prevent program, which is a program by the US government to try to come up with new ways of thinking and addressing issues that we're trying to tackle in relation to targeted violence, in relation to radicalization and extremism. As early on, Victoria shared, sometimes we tend to keep doing repeatedly the same things over and over, even if they fail to work. And so I think January 6th in particular, and recognition that there is a problem with more massive radicalization of various groups within the United States. There's a realization, I think, also within the US government that we need to be more creative, more innovative in addressing these issues. And as a result, our project has been selected as one of the 4 finalists in this Invent to Prevent program. We're hoping that that will enable us to get significant funding. We've done this with much smaller funding than we would have wanted to. That would actually allow us to grow this pilot from 6-hour training to a 30-hour training that would where we would be able to address various subsets of biases, going beyond addressing anti-Muslim bias. Next. And I managed to go through all of my slides. Despite technical difficulties, I am we're at the end. For any of you who want to connect with me, there are ways to connect through either email or social media. You have them on this page. And with that, I thank you for listening to me for over an hour. And hopefully we can now, I can switch it to or hand it over to Victoria for any of her final remarks before we go into Q&A.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amra, also for this wonderful presentation and for the wonderful also methods of intervention and professional training course that you have developed before. Giving the floor to Victoria, I just want to welcome Loretta Fabri, who was engaged before in an institutional commitment, and I know that she wants to welcome you before giving the floor to Victoria. I think you can talk.
Mi sentite?
Sì, sì, sì.
Ok. Allora, thank you alle colleghe che sono partecipato a questo interessante dibattito e un abbraccio grande grande a Vittoria. Un bacio anche da parte di Livia, sempre a Vittoria. E,
So I guess you
potrei,
understand, but I can
come dire,
translate if you want.
con l'aiuto di Alessandra, dire che punto siamo con la nostra ricerca e perché abbiamo aperto questo dibattito internazionale. Il primo step, dello scorso anno, riguardante proprio riguardava l'impegno che il Ministero aveva chiesto, era quello di lavorare sulla radicalizzazione, cioè sul come contenere i processi di radicalizzazione. Questo era il grande tema. Vuoi tradurre, Alessandra?
Yes, for sure. So she first give a great thank you to both of you and a huge hug from herself and also from Livia, Francesca's daughter. And then she said that we might help in translation. She wants just to reconstruct the framework of the Forward project. The first step in the first year of the project started with the commitment from the Ministry of Education to work on the topic of radicalization. Vai.
E noi ci chiedemmo se forse era più interessante seguire nei contesti informali come si apprendono le distorsioni, cioè come il pensiero, come dire, ragiona attraverso delle polarizzazioni e si microradicalizza. Va bene? Si può microradicalizzare oggi sul vaccino, ma soprattutto sulla presenza, fra virgolette, di stranieri, no? C'è proprio una polarizzazione che noi abbiamo studiato prendendo in considerazione le scuole, gli spazi pubblici e i commercianti, cioè i commercianti stranieri che piano piano si sono inseriti nei quartieri e sono stati centri di contatto che hanno prodotto la trasformazione delle prospettive. Questo abbiamo aggiunto.
So First of all, we choose to start from exploring the informal context and specifically how meaning perspectives are built, are constructed in informal context, especially how in informal context distorted meaning perspectives and beliefs are constructed. So, for example, micro-radicalized, polarized thinking and behaviors. And so, for example, just think about how macro-radicalized and polarized thinking is built towards vaccine or towards migrants or towards refugees, especially in informal context. We have chosen to study this polarization thinking and its construction, its the way it is formed in open space, in public spaces such as schools, such as squares, such as medical contexts, and such as the type of shops that are open and managed by foreign sellers in the quarters, in the local quarters of the small city and small town in Italy. Vai.
Quest'anno, che è il secondo anno siamo impegnati in questa ricerca, ci siamo chiesti, ci siamo fatti una domanda, cioè una domanda da, come dire, un inquiry, da aprire cioè quali possono essere i processi, perché non parlerei di modelli, i processi di deradicalizzazione, proprio a livello micro, cioè come dire, a livello di vita quotidiana. Cioè, qual è il contributo metodologico che noi possiamo dare a questi costanti processi di microradicalizzazione? Ecco, quindi quali sono anche le metodologie più adatte? Infatti oggi ho ascoltato con piacere il contributo della collega Amra. Scusa Vittoria, non ce l'ho fatta a sentire il tuo perché ero con il lettore. Ecco, quello di dire, apriamo una domanda e vediamo come, va bene, si sta rispondendo e come le diverse risposte possono aiutare a trovare dei criteri comuni. Ecco, quindi dovessimo dare un titolo quest'anno al nostro processo, diremmo quali sono quali sono i modelli di deradicalizzazione di tipo educativo che possiamo utilizzare nella vita quotidiana. Quindi nelle scuole, nei contesti di lavoro anche qui è molto importante, nei parchi, nei momenti di vita quotidiana.
So for this year, that is the second year of the project, we are starting from a question that requires to open an inquiry process. The question is that which might be the processes of deradicalization in the daily life, in the daily contact, in the daily practices. And we are interested to respond to this question from a methodological viewpoint. So we are asking for which can be the methods for the deradicalization of micro-radicalized thinking in daily life and daily context. So she has appreciated so much the intervention of Amra, and she apologized with Victoria because she was engaged with an institutional commitment with the rector and she was unable to hear to your intervention. But she wants to synthesize the question of this second year of the Forward project into this question. Which are the methods and the models for the deradicalization of radicalized and polarized thinking in the public spaces, like in schools, in the workplaces, in the parks, in the public squares, and so on.
Ecco, io mi fermerei qui perché questo è il nostro punto di partenza, chiedendo appunto alle colleghe di poter partecipare con noi a questo tipo di ricerca. Scusa un attimo, aspetta un attimo che
Okay, she wants just to invite you to be part of this inquiry process for this second year and help us to work on this inquiry question that is also a research question. So what are the methods and the models for the radicalization of a polarized and radicalized thinking in a daily life and in a public spaces? And I think that maybe she's going to bring video or something of that kind, but you might answer if you want.
I would just say that it's very kind of her to extend that invitation. And clearly, I think all of us who are on this call are interested in addressing these issues. They're contemporary, they're current, they're necessary in order for our societies to get to a point of better social cohesion. I think Victoria as well talked about increased diversity, demographic diversity. I know particularly in Europe with the migrant refugee communities and how that integration happens and how that happens in daily life is extremely important. In terms of my model of radicalization, I do think that we, in fact, offer, at least in part, one kind of intervention that is very important, that's lacking in educational spaces. In Europe, specifically, we know of some programs that have been attempted, but generally literature suggests and evidence suggests that they have failed. One that I would mention is the UK based PREVENT program that essentially turned into surveillance program of Muslim students and completely neglected the issue of rising white supremacy in the country. We also in the United States know that the current president of the US has publicly acknowledged that white supremacy is the #1 threat to social cohesion in our societies. And so it is a necessary step to look at all of the intervention spaces. I think for me, I would love to find ways to extend this model to other spaces. So not to stay isolated in the formal education. I think that's a first step. It's an important step because they're simply they're limited and typically not successful offerings in terms of preventing radicalization within formal educational institutions. But how do we then extend? For me, the question is, how do we extend this work that I've been doing to other settings? For instance, police structures and police brutality and violence is another big issue. Interactions in prisons. How can we modify this model of educational displacement replacement and adjust it to the populations that are in prison, which we know tend to be more diverse and overrepresent minorities, whether in the US or in Europe. And so I think this is important work. I commend her for thinking of this question, and I would be delighted to be part of it.
Thank you so much. And I don't know, Victoria, if you want to take the floor. And I just want also to thank Debbie Kramlich, who is our colleague from Thailand. I think Amra, Victoria for sure knows Debbie, and I think Amra, you met her on the meeting last Thursday, I think so. And with Debbie, we shared an interest in how to promote cultural safety and cultural humility in classroom with a very strong focus on positionality and positionality issues from educators and teachers. Victoria, please go ahead.
So are you asking me to respond to the question that Loretta proposed primarily?
Yeah.
Yeah. So well, first of all, I would like to reinforce what you were saying about Debbie here, and Amr, when you were talking about your about the work that you're doing in Voices, which really is really important and interesting work. You talked about the need to listen well. And Debbie and Alessandra and I are involved in a collaborative from the transformative learning perspective that also looks at this notion of listening, because it is in the hearing, it is in the truly attending to and openly listening to people and what their story is, that the empathy occurs, as you pointed out, Amra, in your slides. But, I think that's, we think we know about listening because it's something we think we do every day, and that so many things are things that we do in a certain way. And so I think it's really helpful to kind of step back and ask, well, what are the qualities of that kind of listening that will make us hear what what people are going through when they are being alienated, and in a way that really will help us respond. So yes, I think the challenge that you've raised, Loretta, is a very important challenge. Is how can we in fact understand how to really support the learning that has to happen, and some of that is the methods that we teach with, for sure. I think a lot of it ends up being the climate that we create and the degree to which we are able to share our power dynamics, if you would, with students in the classroom, so that we create spaces that are really, trusting spaces, to do this work. So I think it includes, but goes beyond teaching methods, because it goes to how do we set the right climate and how do we support this learning that often occurs not in, it occurs over time. People are at different places and it's a moving target. And we're constantly having to revisit it and help people revisit it. So I think the study of understanding that and being able to get a better appreciation for what happens along the way as people are learning to open up, and what helps them and how that can get supported is really an important challenge to be looking at. What are the models and strategies and approaches that we can use, to make that happen, I think is a very, very, very important step to be moving in, Loretta.
So I guess that now we can have a time for question and answers, also because we have left 30 minutes, and I'm very happy if we can give a voice and listen to, for sure, at the questions and the reflections that can come from the audience. So people can write down in the chat some questions, or they can unmute themselves and pose questions directly to the speakers, to Loretta and to Claudio, for sure.
May I again? I'm sorry, Marina. I'd
Marina,
like to ask.
sure.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'd like to ask Professor Sabika Reyes to talk a bit more about social connectedness, and how can educators help to develop and its relation to radicalization. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to say I would love for you to take our training, and I can't wait for that to be really available to everyone. I think in terms of social connectedness that we particularly work on developing in Voices is this idea of really starting with shattering biases, not explicit biases that we might be aware of, but really tackling implicit biases. We do some testing or offer some established tests in the field of psychology where people take them and begin to realize on their own what some of the implicit biases they have. For instance, disengagement that they may have or perspective they may have with specifically Muslim students, or that teacher who self-reflected and said, well, I value all students equally, but even though I value them equally, I have this perspective on this that is different, or I have these assumptions, what are really implicit biases towards minority students, Black students in the United States. And so we try to engage them with the content that, one, unveils, kind of opens the curtains and lets them see what their implicit biases are. And in that process, when they become self-aware, the next step is really to tackle how do we help them counter it in the classroom? How do we, in various scenarios, if two students get into conflict, let's say one is a Muslim student and one is not, how do they engage and actively, as Victoria said, what are examples or models they can use for listening and engaging in a conversation and understanding what's the larger context that is producing that perhaps direct violence or fight that's happening in the classroom, rather than creating a culture of silence. I think we have fallen in fear to tackle sensitive issues. We have built this in educational systems culture of silence. So for instance, teachers, educators don't want to be reprimanded for saying something that's not politically correct or doing something wrong in classrooms in the United States. I'm sure it's the same in Europe. And by being silent and ignoring some of these dynamics that play out with their students, they're actually missing an opportunity to socially connect with them. They're missing an opportunity to actively listen and respond to it effectively. So we essentially give them examples, circumstances, situations that reproduce what might happen into the classroom, and then suggest, based on the knowledge that you have now about implicit, explicit biases, about your own positionality, about your students' own positionality and their backgrounds that may be affecting their behavior. Now, these are the three ways in which you could respond. But certainly active engagement, active listening, and creating a culture of what we call moral resilience. In other words, that even if I'm upset as, let's say, a first-generation immigrant student who is Muslim, whose family was killed, raped because of my identity, even if I hold that grievance, which is real, how do I direct that grievance into something constructive? So for instance, we engage teachers and offer that to them as a tool in the classroom. How can we use art and photography to demonstrate diverse representation in the classroom, where people might get to learn about Muslims or Black students or Latino students or immigrant students or refugee or migrant students, whatever subgroups exist in those schools, in a very constructive, positive, and not conflict-prone way. And so in a non-violent way, recognizing that representation, diversity, and the beauty that exists in the classroom. So we try to tackle it from many different angles, through many different activities, but really overall building the culture of this resilience, that even if I'm upset, I have modes through which I can engage in listening, conversation, debate, discussion, art, projects. And it doesn't have to be that I respond to my grievances with violence or exclusion or silence or disengagement. Because if we have that, then we are at risk for the next step in the radicalization process.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I would like to add, to that also, because, in thinking about, at the beginning, I said that, the individual behaviors that we're talking about, we are situated in social kind of dynamics, right? So in the classroom, the student brings their home, their family, their community, their Salafi mentor, if they are involved with a mentor, or, if it's a different kind of alienation, it might be a different kind of person with them, and so does the teacher, and so do all the students in the classroom. So you can imagine, I know, Alessandra, you've used frequently the Bronfenbrenner framework in thinking about, theater of the oppressed and other kinds of ways of surfacing conflicts, etc. So we have these multiple things going on. And so there are these really social dynamics that we often, as educators, can't understand completely and aren't able to surface very well, but they're under the surface of things. It goes back to this idea, in some ways, I started with, of motivation. Why are people motivated, right? And people aren't motivated to do things that we tell them they have to do, but they get very excited about doing things that give them joy in one or other way. And so I think one of the things I really appreciate about Amra's teaching is that she engages her students in these projects. And what they learn, they wouldn't learn if she just taught it to them. they discover it. They're engaged in something that they're really interested in putting this module together to bring this to people. And in the process, whether you're a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or a Black person or a white person or a Hispanic person or a Chinese person, those things recede in the interest of working together to get this output that we're all engaged in. And so I think we, as educators, need to also think about how to create those opportunities to really engage people in things that they're doing. The literature, there's a very interesting article that I read that I've shared with practically everybody I know, including I think Alessandra at some point, by Peter Coleman, who works at Teachers College, and he works on conflicts and has gotten very involved in the complexity space in that area. And he studies these social dynamics in networks and in what he calls strange attractors in complex systems. And when you look at this kind of thing, there are kind of dynamics that keep people in place in certain ways. They're strong forces and they're weak forces. And in some ways, it's very hard to directly attack strong forces. But by building up these weak forces, I don't want to call what we're doing here in this seminar a weak force, but it's on the margins of what people are doing in addressing, this radicalization in some ways, and these biases, is to approach it from the point of view of we're all educators. What can we do in our education? We get excited about figuring out how we can educate differently in order to be able to support inclusive classrooms and bring more of this into the classroom. So we are a latent or a weak force on the edges of these very strong forces that are preventing us from doing what we think we need to do. Something can happen in the environment that makes a latent force a stronger force, that brings to the fore something that was just on the periphery, and that makes it central and helps people kind of move forward in a really dynamic way. And so when you asked about social connectedness, I feel like we need to be able, at the heart of transformative learning is perspective taking. And at the heart, Amra, of your model also is this, the problem is when they get cut off from being able to take perspectives, when they can no longer see anything other than the perspectives that their mentor is pushing them towards, and they cut other perspectives off, that we lose them to the ability to help them think differently. So creating really rich environments, engaging people in things they really want to be doing, and bringing together people of all different kinds to work on those things. It's not an easy thing to do for us as educators in classrooms, right? But it seems like we can't just change individuals unless individuals feel that they can be who they want to be in other environments. And so, if you've changed your point of view, that may mean you have to change your friends. That may mean you have to change your lifestyle, because the people who you have been associating with don't want you to adopt this other perspective. They want you to be where they're at. And so it's, we need to be, in some ways, we're much better at the individual transformation than we are at this notion of how do individuals interact with one another socially, and where are the social dynamics that would enable us to create opportunities to explore things, because we're doing things together and we get to know one another in different ways. So it's kind of the other side of the coin, or they're both happening at the same time. But I'm sure a number of the projects and the solutions that you came up with, Amra, and that your students came up with, tap into this, because you're interested in it also, this informal learning that just happens outside of the classroom, and that we can support and we can draw into the classroom to help us understand differently, the things that are going on.
I would absolutely second everything that you just shared, Victoria, and I would just add, just as an example, that I think empirically confirms this importance of change as a collective effort. That does happen with my students. I did a similar project last year, where we created workshops on countering Islamophobia, delivered them. I think we had an audience of 6,000 people over the course of 4 hours, split in 2 hours, where students actually led these discussions. And last semester, this semester, I've had students from all over the world, from Pakistan to Israel, students from China, India, New Zealand, very diverse, Turkey, very different experiences, very different time zones. And all of these students, because they cared to engage, their curiosity was triggered with having a hands-on experience, and really with my promise that, one, I don't know what the final outcome is going to be of this process. And I think that there's uncertainty and there's fear when, particularly in educational formal settings, we don't know what the ultimate outcome is going to be. We didn't know what's the project we're going to produce, and perhaps we could have failed and produced nothing. And so there is trepidation in taking that liberty. But I would add to something that Victoria said, and that is that sometimes in our larger environment, something happens that then gives us that courage and creates a brave space, an opportune space. And I felt that pandemic was this, in a way, opportune moment where I could take the risks and say, let's see what happens, because the social change we've been watching, witnessing over the last few years is so profound and so deep and so dangerous in terms of where the United States could have been on January 7th, that everybody was willing to take that risk and that plunge, if you will. And just as a reflection, the students who partook in this Voices project, we finished our coursework. It is done. And I certainly didn't want them to feel obliged to continue participating on this work. But they met on their own. They meet once a week outside of the class. Team leaders that we have, they met on their own, and they asked me or requested that we continue working through the summer if I would be willing, because they don't want to stop working on this project. And so that tells you that this interest in making a change and effectively partaking in finding a solution to a social issue is an important incentive that we have neglected with our students. Many students cried in the last course because they themselves were willing to engage in the kind of work that they've never experienced before. I had one student who said, I was introvert because when I was in 5th grade, there was a moment when a teacher told me that I need to stop with providing new ideas and being creative and innovation, and I just need to focus on memorizing the content. And this was the first experience in education since then that had given me an opportunity to flourish, because my creativity and innovation was encouraged. And so I absolutely just wanted to share that. I'll stop here, but just wanted to share that to essentially reaffirm what Victoria said, because what we produced is not only transformational on those consumers of the training, but has been transformational for the entire team that partook in this process, myself included.
I know that we have other 2 questions from the chat and from the audience. The one is from Deborah Kramlich, and I want that Debbie, maybe you can pose the questions to our 2 eminent speakers. You can talk. I have unmuted you.
Okay, thank you, Alessandra. Yeah, it's great to be here tonight. I'm taking the course right now, and really welcome this opportunity to learn more. The school where I teach, I'm in a German school in Thailand. We have a very cultural school population, mix of Thai, American, Italian, Austrian, German, Swiss student population. But most of the teachers are German. I'm the only American in the school. And there's, in Germany, you get tenure after 4 years. And the issue of diversity, the issue of inclusion and belonging don't really fit in our school population, as the emphasis is very much on really doing well in school and having the students perform well, head knowledge, cognitive, and the social emotional is more on the side. I do see a lot of issues with students not feeling accepted, belonging, etc. What are things I could do, conversations I could start just to bring in or make people excited about pursuing this conversation more or bringing more awareness to this issue?
Thank you for asking that question, Debbie, and thank you for taking the course. You will see through the course some of the engagements and activities that one could incorporate. But I often think of and I'm going to share again a detail from my own personal experience. I similarly was educated in former Yugoslavia in a very rigorous math, physics prep school. We had anywhere between 13 to 18 courses subject simultaneously. It was a very rigorous kind of communist regime type of education. I never encountered the representation of myself in that context. So all the books that we read, all the math problems I've solved, never actually included a Muslim child's name in them. And so I think there are always ways, even if the school is very sort of academically student outcome performance testing oriented, I think there are always avenues through which you can bring an issue, even in posing things like a simple math question. So a word problem that reflects on something in the social environment that can create a more profound learning experience. As an example, for instance, I will give you an example of something I did with my kids when Trump was elected in the United States, and they really had certain insecurities about what that might mean for them, given who their mother, who their father, and their father is also a first-generation immigrant to this country. And they engaged, for instance, in my older daughter, who is very much focused on math and highly advanced in math, did an activity looking at various districts in the United States and trying to predict, using some statistics, predict who will win the election. Or my younger daughter, who decided to organize an art project in her grade that would look at the art that represents social change in our society and beyond. So I do think that there are ways in which you can stay within the discipline or stay within, if that is the constraint of the institution of the school, within the constraints of the curriculum, but with your own self-awareness on some of these issues, you can diversify how questions are posed, what outcomes are looked for in these activities. I'll also mention research, actually a presentation that I attended many years ago. I can't remember exactly who, it was a PhD student who did research. I believe he was from Canada, and he was looking at math curriculum that ISIS used in parts of Middle East. And what was interesting is that they embedded in all of the math questions, if you kill 2 infidels, and there are 57 of infidels in front of you, how many infidels are left, right? And so obviously I'm simplifying it as an example, but I always see an avenue to build in either inclusion or exclusion, depending on what the intent of the educational process is, into the curriculum. And hopefully once you finish the training, you'll see some of the examples that we give. And my also hope is that as we continue to develop this, we would like to actually develop a full toolkit for teachers where, depending on which level of education you're at, you will have ready-made activities in math, in arts, in social sciences, in biology and chemistry that you can actually draw on, that imbue some of these ideas of moral resilience, social connectedness, diversity, inclusion, tolerance in the activities that the cool toolkit hopefully will offer.
Thank you so much. And before there's another questions, and I also suggest you to see the two wonderful videos that Victoria has shared in the chat. And Victoria, do you want to explain briefly the content of the video? And then there's a question from Nicolina Bosco.
Sure, I'll do that. What I was thinking of, what I've been playing around with that I think is useful around this question of how you look at both the individual and the social context has to do with this, with these ways in which we can understand these social network dynamics that I was speaking about. And the question had been raised around the arts in the chat box. And that's absolutely a way that is very, very useful for engaging people, both as a method of teaching in the classroom. We find that to be very useful. But what this particular example is in Venezuela, the videos, the two videos reference, because some of you probably know this example. It's been written about quite a bit, and it's been adapted to other countries with awareness that the cultural dynamics, of course, are different. And so there are different kinds of things that have to be done to try to do it in a different location. But in Venezuela, one of the key ministers in the country, who was also a musician, and he was also an economist and a very talented guy, he particularly paid attention to the fact that young people were getting into all kinds of crime all over the country because they really didn't have productive things that they could do with their time. And so he engaged in one of the things that Peter Coleman suggests we do if we try to transform these social dynamics, and that is to reconstruct the dynamics so that we create positive and different kinds of inclusive dynamics in the system. And I hear you talking about that, Amra, in the work that you're doing also. And one of the ways that he did this, because he himself was a musician, and many people in Venezuela are engaged in music and dance and these things, is he said, well, what if we made it possible for any of these young people who wanted to get engaged in music to have music teaching and training, and they could form orchestras and they could be involved in music. And so he started this with 5 students in his garage. It's now got 400,000 young people or more in the country engaged in youth orchestras and various musical presentations, and they include everybody. It's a totally inclusive environment. There is one wonderful video where people who can't speak, or who are they can hear but they can't really speak. They're deaf and dumb. They have what they call the white glove orchestra, in which they wear white gloves, and their director helps them to move their hands in consonance with the beat and with the images that are coming up in the songs. It's just a totally inclusive kind of thing. They create paper instruments for people who don't have the money to buy instruments. It's really amazing. Anyway, those 2 videos pertain to this. And the first video, which is the trailer, is the video. It introduces you to a community in Venezuela of poor children and poor people, and how this got started, how it worked for them, and how it engaged them. The second one is just, if you love music, you'll love it just for the music, but it's a youth orchestra that is demonstrating how empowering this kind of movement can be to inspire in them joy and engagement in music. And you can see that these youth orchestras have everybody of all different kinds of backgrounds and experiences. They have a positive thing that they can do And through the process, it's truly a process that intends to re-socialize, to create new social dynamics. It involves a lot of peer learning and peer support and mentoring and, you know, opportunity to perform and be recognized for the capability that you have. So I'm highly enthusiastic about it. And as Alessandra said, I would recommend you listen to those 2 YouTube videos, but just be aware you might get hooked on it.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And we hear also the voice of Peter, and we send him a huge welcome from University of Siena. We know that he's like our third keynote speaker. So a great welcome from University of Siena. There's 2 questions more. One is from Dr. Nicolina Bosco, and I'm pleased to give her the floor. Her and Eduardo, the floor.
Hello to everyone. Hello, Professor Marsik.
Oh.
It's a great pleasure to see you again.
Likewise, very much.
Hello, Professor Amra. I really appreciate your model, and I was thinking about the operationalization. I don't know if this could be a good term. Also in the classes, in the universities, in multicultural university. My research is focused on identify and explore useful teaching and learning methods and methodologies. I'm sorry about Edo, which can be used in order to deconstruct also intolerance in highly context, in highly multicultural context. And I was really interested about the use of storytelling, which we apply with my colleague Alessandra Romano. And I was thinking about the possibility, and this is my question, to use your excellent model, and thank you so much for your precise description, also in university classes, because I was thinking about the possibility to use the storytelling to prevent the micro-radicalization, considering the everyday life, but also considering the, maybe I can say, the main object of my research, which is, of course, insert in the forward project. And thank you again.
You're welcome. Absolutely. I think this model has the use in various contexts, and I look forward to actually in the coming years witnessing how researchers like you and scholars like you take it to the next level, explore it in different contexts. So I think I've created a process or understanding of the process, how radicalization happens. But I think what the true value of the model is to look at the ways in which we can take that learning to inform what we offer to actually counter radicalization. So just an example that Victoria has shared is precisely the kind of engagement we want in formal and informal educational spaces, to offer that alternative so that people do not feel lack of belonging, because it is that exclusion that ultimately sets them on a path of seeking alternatives. And it doesn't mean that everybody who seeks alternatives will radicalize. There are people who have explored Salafism. There are people that I know that I grew up with. In fact, someone who was in a rock band, who was had long hair, big earrings when we were growing up, who became Salafi and then de-radicalized again. And so how do you, even if people are exploring and see these opportunities, how do we imbue those spaces with more projects like what Victoria has talked about, that can draw young people in who don't have a sense of belonging? And that can actually happen in higher education institutions. You know, there's often the assumption that, I'll use example of Muslims who radicalize. There's assumption that somehow these are uneducated groups of people who don't have opportunities. That is the case in many situations. For instance, in the instance of Boko Haram, in Nigeria. There are kids who don't have an alternative, and therefore Boko Haram is the only place of belonging and purpose that they have. And but also look at an example of 9/11 as a terrorist attack, where everyone involved was actually highly educated, or most people were highly educated. And so that speaks to the fact that it's not about academic performance. It's not about having education or not. It is in fact about having this place where one feels included, heard, seen, and as having a voice. Owning voice in the classroom is very important, and that's particularly important in the higher education setting. So to add to that, my book, the Cat I Never Named, is also intended to kind of go with this model to allow people to, through a storytelling channel, to really explore these issues and say, how do I feel about my belonging? Do I recognize the feelings, the grievances, the anger, the depression, the exclusion, the war, the conflict, the violence? Do I recognize myself in this? And if I do, what do I do with that energy? And that's where engaging in the classroom in terms of pedagogy is how we do it, and in terms of the content of what we offer is critical. Do you in your classrooms as a professor offer, I think this was Debbie's question, do you offer opportunities to engage? And so what Victoria exemplified as what started outside of a garage and became a huge movement, because there is a need to fill that lacuna or that gap that exists in terms of learning. So I would love to see what you do, and I'm happy to collaborate with you and talk further after this. And good luck with the baby. It's hard.
Thank you so much. And
thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and there's also another question from Claudio Melacarne, and I took the opportunity to greet also Ismini Cavallari, who was a PhD student, a Greek PhD student. I remember we met in presence 1 year and a half during a webinar with Alexis. Well, it was a seminar in presence actually with Alexis Kokos and Fergal Finnegan. So thank you so much, Ismini, for participating into this webinar. Claudio, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. And this is a very short question. We are at the end of this seminar, so I will try to be very, very fast. And I don't know, I'm very happy because every meeting I reflect on new issues. I don't know if this is a good point. But my point is, my question is this: if in your research or your articles could be useful to find a sort of red flags to define the line before or after we can understand the radicalized process. I mean, if someone are following this seminar or read our article, probably could ask us to be more clear about what is the rules we can use to define where I have to say stop. We are in a dangerous area. You are at the limit of the right to say what you can to say, because this is for example, for the public decision maker, it is a very hard point, because I have a right I'm free to say what I think, but what is the limit of this? And what is the limit to the, what is the path, the red flags that can say to me that I are going to a dangerous setting? So the question is this. I don't know, Amra, if you found in literature some criteria to say that after this point we are into the violent radicalization, into the area of security, and before we are in the area of education. I don't know if I was clear about this.
Let me try to repeat the question just to make sure I understood it. I think your question is asking when do we, as educators in the classroom, let's say we're having a discussion, when do you see red flags for, somebody is really going to become a terrorist? Is that what you're saying?
Or becoming a violence?
If it were easy, to say, here's a red line, obviously we would have solutions to, we would have an answer to that question. Certainly not an easy question. The danger with that question when it comes to really being able to engage in open discussion, having the freedom to discuss issues, is that because of our own implicit biases and frameworks that already exist, what tends to happen in the classroom when teachers are not trained to handle these difficult conversations is that they end up othering or profiling specific groups of students, in the same way that police tends to profile a Black kid who is wearing a hoodie or driving and is more likely to be killed as somebody potentially violent, because of the frameworks that exist in the social sphere that perpetuated these kind of racist narratives. In the similar way, for instance, with the UK Prevent program, there have been countless cases where a student was doing, let's say, research on radicalization. Like I do research all the time. I'm constantly reading papers on radicalization. And so the students have been reported by librarians for taking certain books out to read, or they've been reported by teachers where they were writing a paper for the class, but they were reported because of their Muslim background. Had it been someone that was not Muslim taking the same book out, they wouldn't have been profiled in the same way. And so then the question that one has to tackle to respond to your question is, when do we go from learning and educating to policing? And where is that fine line? And how dangerous is that line? And so there has been scholarship on the Prevent program, where the UK government has admitted that the program has essentially profiled Muslim communities. There's clear problems with that, while not really reporting the signs of white supremacy, because of the larger societal framework that tends to be more prone to be biased towards the Muslim community. And so I'll give you an example of something that occurred in my classroom. In my course on Islam education radicalization, I taught a couple of years ago. There was a student who often talked about examples of white supremacy and how white supremacists handle certain issues and have certain views. And there was a moment in the course when I was threatened by a alumni of Columbia University, a student who completed his college degree, his BA at Columbia, who was a former U.S. Marine, who read an article about my work and read that I was Muslim somewhere, and send a threatening email to me. We never met. He's never been in my class. It was just based on his generic bias. And he included his name, he included his signature, all of his personal information. And I reported it to NYPD. I reported it not only out of concern for my safety, but also out of concern for safety of the students at Columbia, because I knew that as an alumni, he could have access to classes. And I received a threat on late one night, and the following day I had a class. I had to go and teach that very class on Islam education and radicalization. And I was in communication with NYPD. I was clearly in communication with Columbia Security, and I went to teach my course. And what I did in that class was that I actually used that threatening email, and created an exercise in the course around the content, and asked students to reflect how what we were theoretically learning might relate to this case of a threat someone had received. I never disclosed in the exercise that the threat was made towards me until the end of the lesson. So once we were done, I shared that. And the students in my class who had very very specific set of views came to my office hours and said, "You've changed me. You've allowed me to have my perspective, and you responded to it constructively, but you actually changed me, because for the first time I saw what is potential consequence of having the biased view that I held. And I admit now that I had this kind of perspective, and seeing consequentially what happens to someone who's target of hate was important." And so I think that there are there's some work that has been done in Australia, developing a curriculum where people who have actually been victims of extremism, or their family members are brought in to speak, to actually give a concrete example to individuals. When you hold these views, what is the consequence? And so it's a very delicate space. I recognize your concern. It's a delicate space to engage in these difficult conversations. But I think that we are at the greater risk of mass radicalization if we don't explore this space. And what will be that red line, right? What is the red line is often dependent on the level of knowledge, our own positionality, our own training, which we know tends to lack in the educational spaces as it stands now. So I think once we can train people better, once we as an education community engage in this conversation and explore that question, what is the red line, then we will have better answers. But I think we have to go there, and we have to see what are possibilities and what are limitations within those spaces as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I know that also Andrei Zgorla, who is a PhD student, who is working with us under the supervision of Claudio Della Carne, has posed some question in the chat, and you, Victoria, has responded. Well, there could be also many other questions that we would like to pose you, but we know that the time is over, and actually we were supposed and expected to finish at 6 p.m. Italian time and noon EST time, and we are later of 15 minutes. This is a typical, no, I'm joking, of Italian, no, I'm still joking, okay. But I have the honor to conclude this meeting, and I just wanna again thank you for your very, very precious interventions. And Claudio is right, and Loretta is right. Every time we have the opportunity to meet with you and discuss with the both of you, this is a very learningful and meaningful opportunity for all of us. I need also to honor all the participants that here in the WebEx room and also on YouTube channel are still attending the meeting, even if we are a little bit later. And I need to thank the colleagues from the University of Siena, Francesca Torlone, Mario Giampaolo, Mari Carullo, and the other, Francesca Bianchi, Carlo Refice, that were with us all the time, and also for sure the PhD students that are still attending the meeting. I just wanna conclude with an invitation to be part of our second year of the project, and with the wish to meet in presence as soon as possible. It would be a great honor to have all of you here in Arezzo, in the Department of Education, and for sure we are considering to meet in presence for the next year, for the next International Transformative Learning Conference in 2022. We are also creating an international and inter-university, cross-universities laboratory on the topic of radicalization and de-radicalization, and we hope to have you in the scientific committee of the laboratory that will be the implementation part of the second year of the Forward project. And we know that both of you have will present together an intervention during the AGT conference, the Adult Education on Global Times conference that will be held in June, and we hope to for sure be participate also as a audience into your session, when in the session in which will be presented your intervention. And again, thank you so much for all the learning that we have gained with you and through your interventions today. As you know, we are we are your fan. You know this, we follow you, and for sure we will deepen the aspects that and the insights that emerged today, and we hope to understand more, and for sure one day to be able to be part of the extended training programs of the model of displacement, replacement of radicalization. So, well, of the voice courses to be clear. Thank you so much for your participation, and thank you to all of you for your presence here at at 6:20. Again, thank you so much. Thank you. And we will make available also the video recording of the meeting, and we hope to have other opportunities to discuss and confront with you. And for sure, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Also, we've really enjoyed being part of your community, and we always do, and enjoy sharing with you, and really applaud the work that you're doing, which is so important.
Thank you, everyone. I second that.
Thank you
so
very
much.
much.
Thank you. And I don't know if you are able to see the applauses from the audience.
Yes, it's lovely.
They are all for you. Thank you so much.
I really like that.
And we will close the WebEx room so everyone can leave, and we will close the WebEx room. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Enjoy
much.
the rest of